Observer Stationery and Craft Shop, 219 Argyle Street, Dunoon, at the traffic lights.
For over 60 years, Gleaner Oils have been providing a quality service from local depots throughout Scotland. We pride ourselves in knowing what our customers want of us and are equally proud in providing what is expected of us. Across the rural countryside, through villages and towns, and regardless of the weather, we will not let you down. Gleaner Oils and Fuels. Telephone free on 0800 833 534.
You're always sure to meet a friend before you leave the quay. Sailing in the Clyde on the Waverley, a grand old boat is the Waverley. So back you down to Rossie and be back for tea, the way that you did when you were wee. You watched the paddles going round and round, heard the engine stumping sound. Your happy young heart would start to pound at the thought of reaching the sea. Sailing in the Clyde on the Waverley, a grand old boat is the Waverley.
Hello there, I'm Neil Alexander, and this programme is called Just Talking, and it's from Dunoon Borough Hall. It's on a real hot red topic too, and it's called The Ferries, known locally as the bathtubs, and it was before a large audience. So it's over to the Vice Chairman of Dunoon Ferry Action Group, John Patterson. So over to you, John.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, before I talk about the meeting that I had, or the two meetings that I attended last week, I think I should go over again very, very briefly the background to this, particularly for those who have come tonight who haven't attended one of these meetings before. And it's this background that it really is the problem. A policy was developed by the government in the early 1980s. Yes, it does go as far back as that, when the Clyde-Argyll service was to carry all the vehicles and a small passenger-only service was to serve Dunoon Gourock. It was defeated by local opposition. It went to a body called the Transport Users Consultative Committee for Scotland, which sadly no longer exists. And their unanimous report said it was illogical to separate the vehicle and passenger service, and hardship would be caused to users if a small vessel was placed on the route. And surprise, surprise, that's exactly what we've got now. The service was reduced to one sailing an hour, and subsequent Labour, Liberal Democrat and SNP governments have all promised action, but they have been stymied by Transport Scotland, the Transport Department, and then subsequently Transport Scotland. This department is the constant in all of this. And the policy developed in the 80s has been handed down to successive civil servants who advise transport ministers. And it's a mindset that they're not prepared to alter, no matter what. In 2009, there was an EU ruling which they constantly quote to successive transport ministers. And they say that it prevents vehicle carrying on the Gourock-Dunoon route. It doesn't do that at all. What it says is that vehicles may not be subsidised. But then, of course, we're not asking for a subsidised vehicle service. The last 2 years of the streaker service, this was the case. The vehicles were unsubsidised and they made a profit on the vehicle carrying element. Since 2011, we've been promised open and transparent dealings with Transport Scotland and a succession of transport ministers. And after years of protracted negotiations, we reached a 3-point agreement. This was referred to in the letter we submitted to the local paper last week. And the points were that any replacement vessel would be a minimum of 40 metres in length. The benchmark for reliability would be the former streaker service, and it would be a 12-year contract. For the last 2 years, in this so-called live tendering exercise, which really hasn't been that at all, but that was the excuse, no meetings have been allowed with Transport Scotland and ministers. Communications have been ignored, and even registered mail has been lost. After insisting in 2011 that we must withdraw from the CalMac network and the route must be tendered, earlier this year, it was handed back to CalMac with no tendering. So relating to the three-point agreement that I referred to earlier, tendering has been cancelled, the benchmark reliability has been ignored, and the 40-metre minimum length of the vessel is now questioned, even though that was what was suggested by marine experts. We're not marine experts, and I apologise if there is any marine expert in the audience, but I don't believe there's one there as well. Transport Scotland most certainly are not marine experts, and therefore their comments on all of this are really not valid. The MVA report, however, produced by marine experts, said that 40 metres was the minimum length of vessel required. Now, I suggest that the questioning of that 40-metre length is because vehicle carrying vessels on the Clyde-Argyll route are 43 metres. So, inevitably, the demand would be, if you've got a vessel of 43 metres, you should be carrying vehicles on it. So, it's a far better idea to make them smaller so that the people of Dunoon will not demand a vehicle service. The stark lesson for individuals or any groups of you who might think of campaigning is this. Officials agree to various things and then they later on either ignore them or they question them. Now, the two meetings that I attended, the first one was organised by the Dunoon Observer and Argyllshire Standard, and the second was our committee meeting to which the Transport Minister was invited. I'm going to merge the reports together and I'm going to entitle it Kicking the Can Further Down the Road. We were told that the service had to be passenger only. It was a difficult decision. It was a very hard decision to make, but it had to be passenger only, unfortunately. It was put to the Minister by Gordon Nish, our proposal, actually, about leasing the car deck. He said it was interesting. He said he would look at it, but it will be passenger only. On funding, now we were always under the impression, as I'm sure many of you are, that funding is a problem, that the government just don't have the money. And so we were looking at creative ways in which that could be done. And we were looking and we were contacting pension funds and so on. And we put that proposal to the Minister. And he said it was very interesting, but it really wasn't necessary because finance was built into the ferry plan, so it wasn't needed. And ferries will be financed by the conventional route through CalMac and CMAL. That's very interesting. And meantime, they would be consulting on the ferries and consulting on the facilities on the ferries. Well, if it's a passenger-only service, I think the best we can hope for is a machine serving tea and coffee. I don't think there'll be much more than that. So I think that consultation would take about 5 minutes. He wanted to encourage the use of the service, so I immediately came back, well, if that's the case, then you should have RET, because RET is on every other route in the West Coast, except Burgh at Dunoon. And why should it cost more to come to Dunoon on these ferries than it is to go on the big ferries to Butte, on an even bigger ferry to Arran? And the reason is because they've got RET and we don't. The vessels aren't fit for purpose, we know all that. And then we had this piece of nonsense, that passenger only is the future, that vehicle carrying is a sort of 20th century concept which really doesn't apply any longer. Well, that's completely at variance with what's happening just along the road, and it's completely at variance with what's happening on the whole West Coast, because CalMac and McBrain's took a policy decision for dual-purpose vessels, because it's vehicles that make the money, it's not passengers. Passenger services will always require a subsidy, but they can be cross-subsidised through vehicle carrying. The Minister said he would prepare to look at any proposals and he was open to suggestions. But, as you may have guessed by now, the service would still be passenger only. Now, we maintain as a committee, and it's a passionate view I have, that a passenger-only service will be extremely vulnerable. And it's vulnerable because it will be open to legal challenge over subsidy, and it will be open to Audit Scotland coming along, or Transport Scotland coming along and saying this is costing too much money and we've got to abandon it altogether. A vehicle passenger service, however, is a totally different situation, because a vehicle carrying element means that the money will be made and you can cross-subsidise if you wish, and that reduces the public subsidy. And I have to remind you that in the last 2 years of the operation of the Saturn as the final streaker that we had, the car carrying element made a profit. Now, it's only common sense, therefore, to have a vehicle passenger. It's far more secure. That officials steadfastly refuse must mean that there is some overriding imperative which makes them do this. The decision on passenger only was principally based on the Audit Scotland report, and mention will be made of this later, but I particularly highlighted the figures of £13 million requiring to be spent at Burgh and £30 million each for the ferries. Now, they admitted, the officials and the Transport Minister, that the 13 million was what they said was the top end of the estimate for Burgh. Actually, it's nothing like that as far as the Dunoon service is concerned. It would be a high figure would be 1.5 million, I would think, to upgrade the link span and to do some repairs. And the £30 million each for the vessels, they didn't agree with. But, and this is extremely important, ladies and gentlemen, when the Audit Scotland report came out, Transport Scotland, CalMac, CMAL, and those who advised Audit Scotland all had sight of that report, yet none of them challenged these figures because it didn't suit them to challenge them. Nobody highlighted that. And as soon as we saw the report, we immediately homed in on these two figures because they are wrong. They are utterly, totally wrong. But they are being used as an excuse to deny us a proper service. So when are we going to see the improvements? Well, you'll have seen it reported in the local paper. It's going to be 3 years, which will then take us to a 10-year period where we've had this rubbish. And we're told that Isla comes first. Isla's got to get their new vessel first before we do, even though money supposedly is built in. My great worry is that because of Transport Scotland's lack of investment in the whole CalMac fleet, which is ageing rapidly, that there will always be a service which will come ahead of ours. 3 years before we're supposed to get a new ferries. In 2 years' time, there will be Holyrood elections. And no matter what the outcome of that, there's almost certain to be a new Transport Minister. So the whole thing will start all over again. This 10 years of a service like this, it's quite clear that CalMac and the Transport Scotland don't want to run it. If they don't want to run it, step aside and do a proper tendering, reduce the charges at Burgh, which are so punitive it puts people off, and let somebody else run it. Vehicle passenger is the best for the community and it's the best for the taxpayer. The Dunoon project is a very exciting project. It's to be greatly welcomed. And even today's Observer, the editorial, and I quote, "The case for a commercial vehicle service to the town centre will be undeniable. It would be a total travesty in view of that project if we were denied a vehicle service. If they're not prepared to operate it, hand it over to someone else. That's kicking the can further down the road. Thank you.
Dunoon Community Radio, brought to you by the Observer Stationery and Craft Shop, 219 Argyle Street, Dunoon, at the traffic lights.
Oh, thanks, John. That was clear and illuminating. You did kick that can. Now it's over to Robert Trevis, who is the marine and sea expert for Dunoon Gourock Ferry Action Group, and he will spell out the facts on the ferries.
Hello. I'm afraid my blood was boiling when I read my Dunoon Observer this morning. Fortunately, I read it a few hours ago, so you're not going to hear as many expletives as were likely to come out otherwise. There's a letter in there from Mike Russell, who's our MSP. He's also a cabinet minister, and the policy of the Scottish Government has been to have a vehicle ferry service on Dunoon. So bear that in mind while I read this. First of all, cast your mind back to 2011. Transport Scotland announced that there was going to be a world-class ferry service in Dunoon. Now, what did our MSP do at that point in time? The Alley Cat was already in service on this route. He knew it couldn't handle the weather. Its classification means it can't set sail unless it's fine, clear, settled weather with a sea state such as to cause no more than moderate pitching and or rolling. He knew that it had been banned from using Dunoon Pier in wave heights more than 2 feet, that's knee-high waves, because of a safety incident. So did he leap up and down saying, "What the heck are you doing here? This isn't going to work"? No. He turned to you, his constituents, and said, "Use it or lose it." Right? Use it or lose it. So here's what Mr. Use It or Lose It got my back up with in the newspaper today. He's only got 2 points, really. First one, seek urgent and permanent improvements to the reliability and comfort of the passenger service. That's the existing service. He hasn't really done his homework, has he? Because the first minister to deal with this was Alex Neil. When he came in, he immediately said, these vessels are not fit for purpose. And he instructed Transport Scotland and Argyle Ferries to come up with an improvement plan. That was 7 years ago now, right? They basically sat on their hands and did nothing. The action group said, we want relief buses so that people aren't left stranded at either end when the ferries go off. We managed to get that. We realised that the Carushk was sitting unused over the winter, but manned and with its generators and so on running and paying harbour dues. So we said, we want that vessel on the route in the winter so that people have got some chance of getting across. The response from Transport Scotland was to try and tell the person dealing with it at that time, who was the Deputy First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, that the Carushk couldn't be used because it couldn't keep to timetable on the crossing. Now, we had advisors who told us otherwise. We managed to convince Nicola Sturgeon that that was not the case, and very bravely she put the Carushk on the route, and we were proven right. And it's been a real... Anyone who sails regularly on the crossing in the winter knows that the Carushk is a real blessing because it gives you a bit of a respite from the worst of the cancellations. So that's where we stood on improvements. But the one that really got me was the next one, where he basically says, regarding the new ferries, these do not have to be, and indeed should not be, vessels of the vehicle carrying size that some still want to demand. Right? Now, you've had 3 official reports. The first one said, you can't use small vessels, they won't be reliable. The second one, the Deloitte-Touche report, said you need large hulls on the Clyde. The third report involved Royal Navy captains in part of the assessment, right? They sailed on Argyle ferries, they sailed on Western ferries, They spoke with ship's masters. They looked at the statistics of the weather and the sea conditions on the route. They analysed the route, and they came up with a couple of tables. And they had two tables. Table 1, passenger-only vessel, 40 to 50 metres. Table 2, passenger and ro-ro vehicle vessel, 45 to 65 metres. Now, Mr. Russell in his letter is saying that some people are demanding vehicle-carrying sized vessels. We're not. All the action group has ever said is at least 40 metres, which is the minimum for a passenger vessel. And the actual report said the overall length of a vessel must be above the most likely worst-case scenario of wavelength, in this case assumed to be 40 metres. Now, I've sent the new minister, Paul Wheelhouse, a video of Western ferries attempting to dock a 50-metre car vessel in the sea conditions here. It had plenty of vehicles. They leave a space in bad weather, obviously, but they had plenty of vehicles on it, buses. I think there might have been a lorry and there's certainly a number of cars. They had a hard time docking, and that's a 50-metre vessel. Now, given that the report is saying a 40 to 50-metre passenger-only vessel or a 45 to 65-metre vehicle vessel, which do you think would be the most reliable? I mean, it's not, you don't have to be a maritime expert to figure out that the larger vessel, the vehicle one, is going to be the more reliable. But we've only been pressing for the lower size, the 40-metre one. But they're trying to go even lower still, despite their experience on the route. They've seen what happens with small vessels, and despite 3 reports. Okay, that's my rant over now. Blood pressure restored to normal. I want to go to some other things. There's an interesting court case in the Court of Session in Edinburgh at the moment. The Scottish Government wants to subsidise ferry services between Aberdeen and Orkney, Shetland, to the tune of £370 million. However, there's already a commercial operator, Pentland Ferries, which runs between Orkney and Shetland. It runs between Caithness and Orkney. Pentland Ferries claim that the subsidy is unlawful state aid, and hence the court case. Now, what's interesting about this is the different way that the government is treating the Northern Isles contract and the Dunoon ferry crossing. It's prepared to go to court and fight over Northern Isles, where both the passengers and the vehicles will be subsidised. In Dunoon, though, it sits on its hands, even though in Dunoon it will not be subsidising vehicles, and it's allowed to subsidise passengers. In Dunoon, we seem to have to go through hoops to demonstrate vehicles are not subsidised, but for Northern Isles, the government just pushes on regardless. Over the 7 years that Transport Scotland have supposed to have been delivering government policy to have vehicles on the crossing, they've done nothing to explore how that might be achieved. They did not even manage to issue a passenger service tender. And that's what the tender's for. It's for a passenger service with vehicles as an option. It's the action group which has suggested getting around one of the problems on costs by leasing the harbour facilities. It's the action group that came up with getting private finance to build vessels and then lease them to CMAL. That's detailed in this leaflet. We suggested pension funds, but it could be a bank or another investor. Lloyds Bank already does something similar. They own the MV Loch Seaforth, which they lease, which serves Stornoway, and they lease it back to CMAL, therefore making their profit. But it's good to hear that the Scottish Government has the money for the ferries anyway. The point is that there's lots of ways that you could, innovative ways that you could think of funding this, and Transport Scotland were doing nothing. It's left up to the public to actually come up with ideas. Right. There's ample actual just common sense evidence that the vehicle carrying ferries in Dunoon would generate a profit. Not only are there official reports saying it, you've got Deloitte Touche and MVA, but there's the example of the unreliable passenger-only service. The unreliable service actually takes up more subsidy than the reliable streaker service did. So you can compare a vehicle service with a passenger service. The reliable vehicle one is cheaper to run once they've taken account of all the things they have to do to make up for the deficiencies of the passenger service. As John said, the streaker services produced accounts, but they produced audited accounts that separated the vehicle carrying from the passenger. They presented these to the Scottish Government, who accepted the figures and said, yes, the vehicle carrying is profitable. That was then presented to the European Commission, who also agreed that the vehicle service wasn't being subsidised. Now, they did this despite the streaker service being absolutely hamstrung by the timetable. They started late, they finished early, and they only sailed once an hour. They were saddled with a ticketing system that deterred customers, and they were not allowed to attract regular commercial vehicles by offering them a discount. And despite all these handicaps, they still managed to make a profit on the vehicle carrying. Now, when you sit here, it's your local service, and it's very easy to underestimate the importance of it. The very first vehicle service in Scotland was to Dunoon, and the town has been built up round about it. It's evolved with the ferry service at its heart. In 2010, the streaker service carried 10,866 passengers on Kilgames Saturday. Kilgames passed, the number had fallen to 3,263. A massive drop, right? So, given that we've dropped right down from over almost 11,000 down to just over 3,000, where do you think Dunoon sits in the league table of CalMac's 28 routes in terms of passenger carrying? There's 28 routes. Where do you think we sit? Maybe 20th? 15th? No, we're 5th. Despite that massive drop in numbers, we're still 5th. And another really interesting thing to consider is that in 2014, Western Ferries carried one quarter of all the vehicle carryings nationwide in Scotland. It had one quarter of all the ferry services carrying vehicles, just through Western Ferries. We had a two-vehicle ferry service for many years, and the idea that there's not enough business for two-vehicle ferries just doesn't hold water. We here pay our taxes, and nationally, those are used to subsidise things. We subsidise the roads. We subsidise the bridges, including billions for the Forth Road Bridge. We subsidise RET, which, as John says, we don't get on this crossing. And we also subsidise this 370 million Northern Isles contract if it goes through. Why should we not benefit? An adult return to Dunoon is £9.60. The longer crossing to Butte, subsidised by RET, is £6.50. That's a significant difference. You can even get to Skye on a subsidised RET fee of £6. Now, you might not know it, but Skye's actually got a bridge, and it also has a commercial ferry service, and yet it's got a subsidised RET service, but we don't. There's nothing virtuous about not receiving a subsidy. Western does not get a subsidy. But that means everyone in Cowell, whether they use the ferries or not, has to bear the full cost of paying for the Western services. And it's an extremely profitable company. Rather than those costs being shared across the nation, as with bridges and roads and all the rest of it. We need a town centre ferry service. They have to be large vessels, and so it makes sense for them to carry vehicles. Even if you're dithering, some people, I don't mind, as long as it's reliable, it can be a passenger ferry service, that's fine. As long as everybody has one clear demand, as per all the reports, vessels of at least 40 metres providing a reliable, frequent town centre service. Thank you.
Dunoon Community Radio, brought to you by the Observer Stationery and Craft Shop, 219 Argyle Street, Dunoon, at the traffic lights.
Thanks, Robert. That was excellent. and very clear. The next speaker is Ken Barr, ex-Community Council Chairman for Dunoon, and he's on about Transport Scotland and the civil service and their total lack of understanding. So, he's going to be talking about marine affairs, the Transport Scotland and the civil service and their lack of knowledge.
Good evening. Transport Scotland. Many of you will remember some years ago that a gentleman called Graham Laidlaw came to this town to discuss ferry options. And when asked why he wasn't discussing Dunoon Guruk, he said, because I say so. Now that's a senior civil servant who doesn't even know the meaning of the word civil or servant. They have been, Transport Scotland, as John has said, have been the bugbear at all times. We've had 7 years of meetings with them. Every meeting we've had, we've gone one step forward, we think, only to find at the next meeting we've actually gone 2 steps backward. And as John says, they don't know anything about boats. One of their senior fellows at one of our meetings said, surely it's weight, not length that matters, not understanding the problem of waves. And the boat has to sit on 3 of them at least to stop it pitching and yolling about all over the place. I don't know how many of you know how this group of companies is set up. David McBrain is the holding company, Seamal owns the ferries and the harbours, and Calmac actually operates the ferries. Now, we were constantly told by the civil servants they're autonomous. Now, we had a meeting with Seamal, and sitting in the corner was the same gentleman who said weight was more important, not the length, a senior civil servant. And when we asked the managing director of Seamal why he wasn't able to do something, he said, because I do what they tell me. So they're not really. So if you're going to report and complain to anybody, complain to the minister and complain about the civil service briefing of him, because they have clearly misled successive ministers throughout their entire things. We had to teach. I mean, I'm an ex-Royal Navy. I'm also an ex-commercial yacht skipper. I know a little bit about boats. When they first came out with their tender, it had to meet MSN 283. Now, MSN 283 is for recreational things carrying no more than 12 people. And that's what they were planning to put these boats through. They didn't know anything about it. They obviously didn't even know what they were even doing at that stage. What else did I say? Well, John mentioned, or I think Robert mentioned, that they're not coping, the other company. I was across at the hospital today. Had to get the 11 o'clock ferry. I was the second last car on, and there were cars left behind. On the way back at 3 o'clock this afternoon, I was comparatively near the front, but before the vessel left, there were still cars being left behind. So to say that they're coping is not really accurate. Finally, I would just like to read you a bit of the history of this. Going back to 1986, Calmac tried in 1986 to prove to the then Scottish Development Department that they could actually make a profit on that route. So they instituted 56 extra sailings a week for a 3-month period and made a large profit of 100,000. That's in 1986, I think. After much discussion, they eventually got this letter from the then, I don't know what he is, but a gentleman called Niall Campbell, who was a civil servant in the Scottish Development Department under a certain lady whom we all remember. He writes, Dear Colin, as you know, this is Colin Patterson, who was managing director of Caledonian McBrain. As you know, there's been a fair amount of correspondence over the past 2 years over Caledonian McBrain's service between Guruk and Dunoon, and I think it would be helpful to state the position clearly. The basic arrangement for this crossing is that a commercial operator provides the main service, carrying vehicles and passengers between Hunters Quay and Mackinaws Point. However, since this crossing is not as convenient for foot passengers as the Caledonian McBrain crossing, the Secretary of State subsidises, brain crossing, which the Secretary of State subsidises, as part of his overall undertaking with Caledonia McBrain, an hourly service also carries vehicles. Given that there is adequate capacity on the route with the Calmac hourly service and the Western Ferry service, there seems to be no grounds for increasing the frequency of Calmac service above the hourly service, which parts of the undertaking. Now, there are two words here that I've used already, the basic arrangement, and they talk about the undertaking. Think about that. However, Calmac have added 4 scheduled services to this hourly service pattern. We've studied the figures you've produced, these sailings, and it appears you're making a surplus on these sailings. Just count the 4 extra sailings that they did, that's 2 in the morning and 2 at night. He then goes on to say, I can see no case for any additional services, scheduled or otherwise, with the exception of the period of the Cal Games, when there is an exceptional demand on the Dunoon crossing, beyond the hourly service and the 4 additional crossings mentioned. Extra unscheduled crossings will lead to expectations among the travelling public and may build up a pattern of additional sailings which will be contrary to the spirit of the arrangements, there's that word again, on this route, and unnecessary in terms of overall demand. We've discussed this difficult question a number of times, and I hope this is a clear statement of the position. I'm sending a copy of this letter to Mr. Irwin. Now, the travelling covenant, the unscheduled strikes will lead to expectations among the travelling public. We've obviously been ignored by the civil servants. There's no clearer worse than that. And the basic arrangement, I want to know what the basic arrangement is. And I also want to know what the undertaking was between Calmac and Western Ferries. So I will leave it at that. But just make sure when you do write, mention that the Minister appears to have been misled. Cheers.
Dunoon Community Radio, brought to you by the Observer Stationery and Craft Shop, 219 Argyle Street, Dunoon, at the traffic lights.
So we now go to the floor of the packed hall to hear the voice of Mick Rice, Treasurer of Dunoon Gourock Ferry Action Group and local candidate for the Labour Party at the next election. So from the floor of the hall, here is Mick Rice.
Thank you very much, Ken, for that. I'd like to hand to John to chair the next 4 items on the agenda.
Right, folks, we have speakers from various political parties here tonight, and that's as it should be. And the first is Mick Rice, who speaks on behalf of the Labour Party and has a report on Audit Scotland that may have influenced the decision about the ferries. Thanks, Mick.
Colleagues, I'm a proud member of the Labour Party, but if you expect me here tonight to bang on about how good the Labour Party is, you will be disappointed, because I think that we have a lot to apologise for, particularly when we were in government under Tony Blair. And what I want to do tonight is to celebrate the fact that all of the political parties are standing together, shoulder to shoulder, behind the campaign for a proper ferry service from the town centre to Gourock Railhead. And I want to single out in particular those members of the SNP that have stayed with us, and in particular Dave McEwen-Hill, Gordon Blair, and the members of the local SNP branches that know we need to have a proper ferry service, and what we are offered at the moment is useless and needs to be changed as soon as possible. Now, most of you will think when that bathtub boat is cancelled yet again that we as a community are abused and that it's a scandalous outrage that that service was ever introduced. Well, I have got to tell you, it is now official. It is a public scandal. Because we checked the figures. In 2013, the MVA report was published, and it said that new vessels on this route would cost £6 million each. And they evidenced that by looking at the cost of other similar vessels. On the 25th of January 2017, 2.5 years later, at a meeting of the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee at Holyrood, the managing director of David McBrain, Martin Dorchester, was asked how much he thought new vehicle passenger ferries would cost on this route. And he replied, I think somewhere between 25 million and 30 million. He didn't evidence that. He's never been asked to produce any evidence. And you would think that a body like Audit Scotland, that has got auditors, accountants, people trained in scrutiny, would say, hold on a minute, there's a bit of a jump there from 6 million in the middle of 2013, 2.5 years later, to 30 million. You would think that, wouldn't you? But they didn't. They accepted Martin Dorchester's guesstimate as gospel. And on the basis of that figure, they approached Transport Scotland and they said, you've got to consider value for money on the Dunoon-Gourock route because of the £60 million you will have to spend on new ferries. And of course, I've listened to people. When I joined this campaign in 2011, I didn't realise it was going to be a lifetime commitment. I've listened to these officers, and some of them actually believe the codswallop they throw at you. But I do believe, unfortunately, some of them actually lie to your face. We've heard mention of Pentland Ferries. They've just taken delivery, or in the process of taking delivery, of a new vessel. It is a 98 vehicle size vessel, and it takes 430 passengers. It's at least twice the size of any vessel we want on the Gourock-Dunoon route. And they got that vessel for £14 million. A vessel twice the size of what we need. And so the figure of 30 million is a load of codswallop. It is baloney. But Audit Scotland used that figure. In the 2012 ferries plan, it stated that Gourock Harbour would need £13 million expenditure to bring it back to its original state. What they forgot to mention is that in its heyday in the 30s, 40s and 50s, Gourock Harbour was an extremely busy port. And that harbour had iron cast edging on the harbour. And that figure includes the complete reinstallation of iron cladding all around the harbour, when they don't need that. They need a proper link span, which is weight restricted. We know how much a link span costs, because guess what? Western Ferries got 2 new link spans a couple of years ago, and they paid $2 million. They got 2, one either side. They paid $2 million to Ferguson's for that. So the figure of 13 million is a load of phooey. Do you know what Audit Scotland said? They said, you've got to consider value for money, because that 13 million refurbishment cost of Gourock Harbour will be needed, in effect, for the Gourock-Dunoon Ferry. What a load of baloney. And then, and this is the gall of it really, they said to Transport Scotland, right, they said, you've got to bear in mind that there's falling numbers on the route. Well, if you've designed a route to fail, it's inevitable the numbers are going to go down, and therefore you turn around and say the numbers have gone down, we're going to cut it even more. Now, this is Audit Scotland. We think that Audit Scotland have been conned, or they've allowed themselves to be used, because Transport Scotland have been looking for an excuse not to provide us with a decent ferry on the Dunoon route. So what are we going to do? Well, on Monday, we are going to write to the Auditor General of Scotland, and we are going to demand that she retracts her advice because it cannot be substantiated. It cannot be justified. Furthermore, on Monday, we are going to write to the presiding officer of Holyrood of the Scottish Parliament, Ken McIntosh, and we are going to tell him that a committee of the Scottish Parliament has been lied to with regard to the vessel cost for the Dunoon route, and we're going to ask him to set up an inquiry as to what can be done about it. And finally, what I think we ought to do, we ought to write to our own MSP and demand that he campaigns for a public inquiry about why this community has been lied to, why we have been conned, and why we have been abused for so long and had to put up with this useless ferry service. We want a public inquiry into what's gone on and what's gone wrong.
Dunoon Community Radio, brought to you by the Observer Stationery and Craft Shop, 219 Argyle Street, Dunoon, at the traffic lights.
Oh, thanks, Mick. That was Mick, as usual, ebullient and explosive, and talking to the public in the Burgh Hall. Well, everybody, that was a lot to take in. It was as though you were actually there in the hall. There were over a 90 to 100 people on a Friday night in Dunoon. That's exceptionally big. It covered a long saga of despair and scandal regarding the ferries. Dunoon is being slowly but surely strangled to death by incompetent and poor ferries, scandalous ferries, and the size required, the ignorance of Transport Scotland, and they were economical, and they are economical with the truth. Next time, ladies and gentlemen, this programme, Just Talking, Stage 2, will cover the 3 other MSPs and politicians who also spoke at the meeting, plus the public themselves coming from the floor and giving their viewpoints. So please listen in. It should be on next Wednesday, and it's a wee bit like the trailer for what you would say, Line of Duty on TV. You can't wait till it comes. I'll see you then. Bye just now, Neil Alexander.
We are going to write to the presiding officer of Holyrood of the Scottish Parliament, Ken McIntosh, and we are going to tell him that a committee of the Scottish Parliament has been lied to with regard to the vessel cost for the Dunoon route. And we're going to ask him to set up an inquiry as to what can be done about it. And finally, what I think we ought to do, we ought to write to our own MSP and demand that he campaigns for a public inquiry about why this community has been lied to, why we have been conned, and why we have been abused for so long and had to put up with this useless ferry service. We want a public inquiry into what's gone on and what's gone wrong.
Sailing down the Clyde on the Waverley, a grand old boat is the Waverley. Should tack it into Rossi and be back for tea, the way that you did when you were wee. The buskers played at the after end, the kind of tunes that were the trend. You're always sure to meet a friend before you leave the quay. Sailing down the Clyde on the Waverley, a grand old boat is the Waverley. Should tack it into Rossi and be back for tea, the way that you did when you were wee. You watched the paddles going round and round, heard the engines thumping sound. Your happy young heart would start to pound at the thought of reaching the sea. Sailing in the Clyde on the Waverley, the grand old boat is the Waverley. She'll take you down to Rossie and be back for tea, the way that you did when you were wee. Sailing down the Clyde on the Waverley, a grand old boat is the Waverley. She'll take you down to Rossie and be back for tea, the way that you did when you were wee. A boat marina soon they say, for the Glasgow docks where the big ships lay. The rich folk all can sport and play in their ain wee Waverley. Sailing down the Clyde on the Waverley, a grand old boat is the Waverley. She'll take you down to Rossie and be back for tea, the way that you did when you were wee. The shipyard lads would wave hello when building ships was all the go. A dozen shipyards in a row, but now there's only 3. Sailing down the Clyde on the Waverley, a grand old boat is the Waverley. She'll take you down to Rossie and be back for tea, the way that you did when you were wee.
Aloha. As we leave the sun-drenched shores of Glasgow behind, we see the children leaping up and down with their hands in the air. Are they happy? No. They've got broken bottles stuck in the soles of their feet. Clyde Coast landladies are looking bored. The absence of tourists has got them floored. The question they're asking would make you swoon. Why don't they come back to Dunoon? Why this swinging resort, this switched on scene, has 3 pubs, 2 cafes and a fag machine, and hills you can walk up while the rain is running down. Why don't they come back to Dunoon? Long time ago, people would flow in, even from overseas. But in recent years, the only ones on the piers have been seagulls and a few CND. At this point in the song, ladies and gentlemen, we would like to remind you of a competition held in the Glasgow newspapers, where the first prize was a week in Dunoon and the second prize was a fortnight in Dunoon. They can't understand it or hear them roar. We've got Yanks here and fairies by the score, and a nightlife that stops in the afternoon. Why don't they come back to Dunoon?
Dunoon Community Radio, brought to you by the Observer Stationery and Craft Shop, 219 Argyle Street, Dunoon, at the traffic lights.
For over 60 years, Gleaner Oils have been providing a quality service from local depots throughout Scotland. We pride ourselves in knowing what our customers want of us and are equally proud in providing what is expected of us. Across the rural countryside, through villages and towns, and regardless of the weather, we will not let you down. Gleaner Oils and Fuels. Telephone free on 0800 833 534.
If I knew you were coming, I would bake a cake.
Shoemakes cakes for any occasion. Weddings, christenings, birthdays. Add a bit of luxury to your event with Shoemakes Cakes. 23 Castle Street, Dunoon. We're open Tuesday till Saturday. Call Yolanda on 706 049 or find us on Facebook. Quality cakes for your event. Shoemakes Cakes.
For a long time, David Carson has been building a reputation which has made him one of Argyle's most sought-after chefs. Be it for his wined and dined private experience in your own home, or for the special occasion event in a special venue. Or you may have visited David's Pride and Joy, the wined and dined boutique restaurant. Well, there's great news in the wined and dined story. David has now moved to a bigger and better dining location and looks forward to welcoming existing and new clientele at the Boathouse, 72 Victoria Parade, Dunoon, right on the seafront.
Hello, this is Fiona McNeil. Besides presenting Celtic and folk fusions here on Dunoon Community Radio, I am a regular listener. Like other listeners, I have heard the appeals that regularly go out for funding. Now, guess what? I have recently discovered a great, enjoyable way of helping out with the funding. And it all happens at the Radio Charity Shop in Hillfoot Street, Dunoon. I get to purchase some great bargains, knowing that all the monies spent help to pay the bills at Dunoon Community Radio. And equally, when I take in donations, I know where all the money raised by them is going. So pop into the shop, and maybe I'll see you there.
Jane, I've not seen you for ages. You're looking amazing. What's your secret?
Well, I've been exercising, and where I go is friendly and sociable, so I love it.
Oh, brilliant. Where?
Live Argyle. They've got really affordable memberships with unlimited access to all their gyms, fitness classes and swimming pools.
That sounds great.
We've taken the pounds off our memberships with no joining fees, and our all-facility membership prices start from just $24.99. Join today at liveargyle.co.uk.
On mobile, online at celticmusicradio.net.
And to Glasgow on DAB Digital Radio and 95 FM.
Fiskerma agus fáilte go céil is crack is Celtic Music Radio. Smisha Jamie Donloch is mar an avist hami seo sa Soul Food Kitchen and Finiston leis an Dr. Roberts Sanchije fu mienach greenach an Jew Dr. Will.
Maheen.
Stem an away on the Joe Sound.
On and Joe hun maar is avis.
Maheen. Och, hamische on the Joe Sound Kujach. Vami Folovik and J. Herkashinach Amirash. Interaste agus hami Gina few edition kill again. And Jew Hashintal Hoshkin program lay it's a beautiful game lay Hauling the Cavaliers.